Hello, we're Group 11 and we're going to be talking about the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on children. Next slide. Our topics today are going to be over cognitive development, home life, social, psychological aspects, technology, and resources. Next slide. So my name is Desiree.
And I'm Delilah.
And we're going to be talking about cognitive development. Next slide. The population we chose to discuss today was elementary students. These kids are typically ages 5 through 11. There are different theories that psychologists have published for cognitive development. Vygotsky's theory is based on social interactions. His focus was on the zone of proximal development. So this means that children learn based on peers around them who are more knowledgeable. So examples of this can be teachers or even peer-to-peer learning. A student who knows how to tie shoes can definitely show another student how to tie their own shoes. Another psychologist, John Piaget, had 4 blocks in his cognitive theory. Each block has different age groups, and since some kids do start daycare and preschool, their cognitive learning was also affected by the pandemic. Next slide. So we want to know what affects cognitive development. Because of the mandated quarantine and the social distancing, this limited interactions between individuals, which also impacts Vygotsky's theory of learning by social interaction.
3 other topics that were impacted were students doing school online, their sleep, and their appetite. School online was a big change for students because they had to learn how to use the internet and how to handle a laptop. Same with sleep, being at home and not having the same routines that they once did ended up causing bad sleeping habits. Appetite is the other one. A lot of these children were used to getting at least 2 meals a day. And due to COVID-19 and having to do school from home, sometimes they were lucky enough to even get 1. Next slide. These are just some tools that can be used to promote cognitive development. From birth to 2 years, playing peekaboo, the caregiver singing songs, and keeping the child busy with sensory activities. At this age, the child is learning that objects can still be there despite something blocking it, like peekaboo. The caregiver singing along with songs with the child will also help them learn the song and get to the point where they can sing by themselves. Ages 2 to 7, the teacher calling out their names, having them interact on Zoom classes, calling out their names as if they were still physically together in a classroom for attendance. Also, another example would be having them do like jumping jacks on the Zoom classes or having each child read a part of the book from the assignment that day. These are just ways to give the children a sense of what it would be if they were inside the classroom. Ages 7 through 11, telling and listening to stories on Zoom, and teachers can give them thinking games. So telling and listening to stories keeps the students engaged with one another and has them participating in the class despite it being online. By the teachers providing thinking games, it makes students use their brains on how to solve, this game, all while it being fun. Ages 12 and above, teacher, caregiver checking in on the child, giving them an assignment to think about the future. So at this age, the teacher or the caregiver can help by checking in and asking the child how they are doing. Giving the child an assignment of what they look forward to in the future can also encourage them to think on the actions needed to achieve what they are wanting and to also have something to look forward to, despite not being around people and not being in a classroom. Next slide.
Hi, my name is Mikkel, and I will be discussing youth at home during the pandemic. Next slide. The survey of income and program participation shows between the years of 2018 and 2020 that families have actually been spending more time together during the pandemic than they were prior to the pandemic. There has been a 69% on the graph for 2020 that shows that parents are spending time reading to their children before bed. This is a 5% increase when you compare it to 2018, where prior to the pandemic, families were not spending as much time together, whether they're at work or children had, out with friends or doing other school-related activities, this graph does go to show that with the pandemic, families had managed to spend more time together. It also shows that 85% of parents were sharing meals with their children ages 0 through 17, 5 or more times a week. So whether these are family dinners or even having lunches, just spending more of that time has been occurring than it has been prior to the pandemic. Next slide. The child maltreatment slide here shows that there's been an increase in hospital cases for child maltreatment. So hospital records were showing higher frequency of children that are suffering with child maltreatment. And on our table to the right, you can see that there's been a 7.95 decrease in the number of child abuse and neglect reports. So this goes to show that reports of child abuse have been at a record low during the pandemic. So children are stuck at home, and whatever's happening behind those closed doors aren't being addressed out in society. So this also has an impact on foster youth, whether that's their parental visits, they don't get to see their parents, whether it's once a week, once a month, those are immediately halted due to the pandemic. And that affects children. Delayed court hearings, so whether parents are waiting to get full custody or partial custody for their child, whether they're trying to get their child out of the foster care system, that's put on hold due to the pandemic. And that affects the children as well, because they could be in a living situation that's bad on their mental health or bad on their physical health. They could be going through physical or psychological abuse and nobody would know because they're stuck at home. This also goes to show there are fewer mandated reports interacting with youth at home during the pandemic. So these would be your CPS workers, your child advocates, anybody related to the foster youth that would be that voice for them, that would be the person addressing issues that they are maybe not able to say, or maybe they see something but being stuck at home, those kids aren't able to cry out for help or have anybody help them. Next slide. So some key takeaways of youth home life during the COVID-19 pandemic. We can see that there's definitely been a shift in the family dynamics, and that's parents spending more time with their children, whether it's reading, having more family meal times, doing activities. You can also see that higher rate of parental involvement has contributed to the child's well-being as a whole, their happiness, their time spending with their siblings or parents. That has a positive impact on them. But this does raise the question on whether or not children are being exposed to an increased risk and violence. Being behind those closed doors, there is a lot of stress and has been a lot of stress from the pandemic, and those parents could be inflicting that on children, whether it's psychologically or physically. But with a lack of reporting and no data sets available, it's hard for our nation to tell whether or not these children really do need help.
My name is Gabby, and I'm going to be covering the social psychological aspects of the pandemic and the youth. Next slide. Can you go back one more, please? Okay. So one thing I'm going to be covering is social development in school-age children. So there are a number of milestones as far as social emotional development in children, but the three that I want to focus on are stated below. So first one is establish positive and rewarding relationship with others. This is typically developed through interactions that children have with one another, whether it's classroom activities, recess, dramatic play. These are the types of interactions that they have socially in physical interactions. Management of emotions. This is something that is developed through those social interactions with peers or adults. Children tend to learn different ways to deal with their anger, their sadness, or anxiety. Typically with emotional development, it comes from guidance from adults. They show ways that children can manage certain emotions, such as anger. Third one is a form of positive self-concept and self-esteem. So with life experiences, these children form their own identities. They figure out their likes and their dislikes, whether they enjoy a specific activity, they enjoy specific food, or if they like a specific color, just based on the experiences that they they encounter in life. Next slide, please. So looking more into the pandemic, I found a few interesting responses regarding the effects it had on everyone, especially children. The pandemic changed the way children interacted with each other. They went from a classroom setting to a virtual interaction with teachers and students. It opened up a new door for opportunities, but it also created an increase in mental health issues in children. So the quote on the left-hand side, it states that many of the educators and parents I worked with are looking for support with social skills for children. The bottom right states the routines of families were disrupted, but they were added stress and impacted limited resources based on the long days of being in front of computers. Next slide, please. So on this slide, it just shows the different types of impacts that the pandemic had. So about 24% of mental health related emergencies were among elementary children. There were spikes in hunger, homelessness, and obvious trauma and mental health, such as anxiety. Children developed increased separation anxiety, overstimulation, and social anxiety. But with this shift from a virtual interactions, it also unfolded a social and emotional learning educational policies to implement a recovery for the pandemic and to help a better education system for children. Next slide.
Hello everyone, my name is Ajay and I'm going to be presenting technology and the role it's played during the pandemic. Next slide. Can you go back one, please? Excuse me, sorry about that. We're having technical difficulties. Thank you. So the pandemic in a year, and this is kind of gives you a quick glimpse as to what exactly went down. We had a mysterious illness. It shows up in Jan 2020, and by March, the world shut down. Everything from countries sealed borders, sports teams cancel seasons, schools close, and employees go home. Next slide. This definitely changed the work-home life balance. What used to be a life where a parent would go to work for 8 hours of the day, drop their kids off at school or daycare, come home, cook dinner, spend some time with the children doing homework, read them a bedtime story, and go to bed, became raising children 24/7 while dealing with work stress, and also the stresses of raising a child. Many parents weren't really equipped to deal with the issues. More than anything, so neither were the children. Next slide. What might have started off with the children being quite happy from staying home from school also ended up in this. Next slide. The children faced as many hardships as the parents did. They went through the same isolation and withdrawals from their peers as their parents did, and that caused a lot of them to go through stress. And most of the time, these children were also mirroring the stress that the parents were going under. Next slide. 89% of the world's student population ended up back home. Basically, what I'm saying here is the parents not only might have not had the skill sets to cope with their children on a 24/7 basis, the children didn't have the resources that had to kind of grow and spend energy and deal with their mental health issues by professionals at a school or meeting in person. Next slide. With the average depressive disorder and anxiety orders increasing by 41%, sandwiched in between these adults that were facing mental challenges were also the children, and also children that were facing their own mental challenges as well, with depression and anxiety. Next slide. The household environment experiences much things like loss of income, difficulty to pay for household expenses, insufficient food, domestic violence, and troubles that couldn't be accounted for. Next slide. And most of the time, some hardships were faced exponentially within the Hispanic and Black communities. As you can see here through the slide, 3 to 4 hardships or 5 plus more hardships were faced at a much higher percentage in Black and Hispanic families than in Asian and whites. So the pandemic affected us all, but some more than others. Next slide. And as you can see here, 75% of all mental illnesses develop by age 24. That means the children that were coming in with mental issues and mental challenges before the pandemic did nothing but exacerbate those issues. Next slide. So as you can see here, the mental health for boys and girls increased exponentially. Anxiety, depression, withdrawing from family, aggressive behavior. Definitely started to see a lot more numbers increase than before. Next slide. But we adapt. Not only did telemedicine come into play, but families and children had no choice. Luckily, because of video games and the advent of apps and communication devices such as the internet, laptops, and handheld devices such as your phone, children were able to overcome isolation and anxiety by basically reaching out to doctors or online. Next slide. So as you can see here, mental health and televisits basically grew by 470%. We as professionals or budding professionals faced a challenge in the pandemic, and we came up in aces. Next slide. As you can see here, also, not only did a lot of apps develop, but we also had a lot of new telehealth or e-health websites develop, such things as teen counseling, MD Live, Doctor on Demand, Rethink My Therapy, or ThriveWorks. All were basically geared towards children and counseling and using basically online methods. Next slide. And as you can see here, and I wanted to kind of sum up with this, the dynamics might have changed between families, work life and home life, but we are definitely striving to still keep the values. We want our children to be safe, happy, and well. Luckily, telehealth and technology have come a long way, and we're able to basically provide such resources to them in a different way that still makes an impact for their well-being. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Amy, and I'm going to be covering resources, aid, and treatment. So firstly, because we're focusing on children, most of the resources that are going to be available have to be sought out by parents. The CDC and the APA have many online resources going through different activities and conversations to have with the children in order for them to be able to understand the pandemic, like what was happening to them, why it was happening, and then activities to try to keep them busy since they were stuck at home. Another thing that was really recommended by both organizations was to create a routines and try to rebring structure into the child's life that was missing since quarantine started. Also, another thing that was important was having children get that supplemented social and emotional interaction with their peers. A lot of parents started doing this virtually. Platforms like Zoom became used more for that. And social distance playtime outside, wearing masks and things. Also, the stress of having outdoor time and physical activity still part of their life was also a big deal. But this section, I'm focusing more at preventative at-home measures. Some factors to be considered that will kind of differently affect the families is the socioeconomic status. People with a lower socioeconomic status might not be as able to have resources. They don't have as many counselors in their areas or in school psychologists. Rural areas mean that the children, if they want to play with other children, they're farther away. It's harder to be connected that way. And then, of course, having siblings plays a big role because it's easier for a child to be able to have a child already at home to play with. School resources, some of the resources that schools have provided is that they're trying to train teachers to have trauma therapy to be able to be someone that the children can talk to, and the American Rescue Plan Act is giving $170 billion for school funding, and a lot of schools are taking that to put that into therapy and counseling for the children. most of the families, if they're do preventative measures, they're able to do it. But after things start to go back for normal for the kids, if they're still showing behavior that is troubling after 2 to 4 weeks, it would be good to seek therapy. And some of the therapy that is popular is group therapy for children, trauma-focused CBT, and of course, play therapy as well. And then here I just have some creative tools for different ways that people were connecting. Social distancing is one, visiting family members and friends, but keeping them through the window to see each other is another. They had the car drive-throughs for special occasions so that people could still celebrate, but also stay safe. A lot of people would decorate windows so that when people drive through on the windows, that they would be able to change it up and people could go for walks and it would be this fun activity. And then of course, these little libraries where people could try often switch books was a way that the community came together to try to make things a little bit more dynamic and interesting for the children. All right, and this is our reference page. There's the second part of it. This is group 11, and that is our presentation. Thank you so much for watching. All right, can we stop the recording?